Egypt, where he served as a professor and academic dean at an Arabic language theological college in Cairo. Teaching and research include and the cult of the saints, the history of biblical interpretation and canon formation, apocryphal literature, Egyptian Christianity, the Coptic language, Christianity in the Arabic-speaking world and its relation to medieval Judaism and Islam, archaeology, visual and material cultures, gender studies, and the application of anthropological, sociological, and literary methods in the study of the historic texts. He's founder and executive director of the Yale Monastic Archaeology Project, which has sponsored archaeological research at our different sites in Egypt. As an extension of his work, he also directs a project to catalog the Coptic and Arabic manuscripts at a of the Syrians, Deir Syrian, resulting in Forbism, a very short introduction, and the Gnostic chapters, as well as 4 other monograph-length editions and/or translations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Davis.
Thank you so much. Let me begin by saying what an honor it is to be invited to participate in this important event commemorating the Council of Nicaea. I'm deeply honored to be here. I want to thank Brother Antonios for you are such a good teacher. That was one of the clearest presentations on very complicated theology that I've heard, and I learned a lot from you, so thank you for that lecture. Can you hear me better? Yes. Thank you. So today, in honor of its 1700th anniversary, I will be speaking about the ecumenical council that met at Nicaea in the year 325, and what I want to emphasize, my main end point, but a beginning. Those debates, as we heard earlier, continue to rage for 5.5 years. But second, and more centrally, when viewed from a longer-term Coptic Orthodox historical perspective, it was by no means the final expression of Trinitarian faith. What I mean is that the Council of Nicaea has continued to serve as a crucial catalyst for the Church's cultural memory during the subsequent centuries. And today I want to focus on that rich heritage seen through the lens of 2 different monastic communities. Before I get to my primary subject, I want to say a little bit by way of introduction about how and why the Council of Nicaea did not mark the end of theological debate over the Trinity. And so I'll be covering some of the ground that you heard in the first lecture, but that it was the beginning of a long and rich history of Trinitarian devotion. So bringing together theology and practice is one of my interests in my scholarship and in my lecture today. So the council was called in 325 to respond to a vexing theological question. How should the relationship between the supreme God and the Word of God really understood? The extended meditation on this subject that required further interpretation. This is John, the first 2 verses in John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. How could the Word be God and also be with God? And how did this language of God and Word relate to the biblical language of Father and Son found elsewhere in the Gospel, such as in the famous passage in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." A debate over such questions was sparked, as we heard earlier, by an Alexandrian priest named Arius, by God before times and before there was when the Word was not into the future, but created before time, and by saying this in a misguided way, to preserve the unity and uniqueness of God from his perspective. He thought of God the Father specifically. For Arius, only God the Father was eternal and perfect. He also understood the Son to be divine, but because there, in his mind, because there could only be one perfect and eternal God, the Son could not be understood as equal to the Father. Arius' presiding bishop was Alexander of Alexandria. Alexander and later his successor, Athanasius of Alexandria, reacted strongly to Arius' theology. Their doctrine of the Word hinged especially on how they understood salvation to work. They believed that humans were saved through their participation, their union with the eternal Word made flesh. From their perspective, if the Word or the Son of God was created and not fully divine, then participation in Him, union with Him, would not be a guarantee of full salvation. So when news of this Alexandrian debate over Arius' teaching reached the Emperor Constantine's ears, he decided to convene a council, as we've heard, near Nicaea, near the imperial capital, to resolve the matter. To the council, Constantine invited representatives from the east and the west, 318 in total. He himself would attend and would preside over the meeting. This council would later be regarded as the first ecumenical council of the church, but it was called by the emperor. And one of his aims in doing so was to preserve the unity of the empire. According to one of our early sources, the historian Eusebius of Caesarea, in the middle of the discussion at the council, Constantine is said to have intervened, and to everyone's surprise, he proposed a solution to this philosophical problem being debated by the participants. Again, we've heard much about this in the first lecture. He introduced this key term, homoousios, a Greek word that I should mention that is often translated into English as consubstantial, sometimes co-essential, of the same essence or substance. Sorry. Where am I? Let me know if that happens again. Yeah. So in proposing this term, Constantine was rejecting Arius' idea of a created, subordinate word. Instead, he was saying that God and the Word, Father and Son, were of the same essence, of the same substance. This word, homoousios, made its way into the Nicene Creed, which affirms that Jesus Christ, the Word, is, quote, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made. Consubstantial, homoousios, with the Father. On June 19th, 325, the creed was signed. On June 25th, there was a big farewell banquet for all the participants. The day was made into a public holiday. All those present praised the emperor for his brilliance, but there were a number present who silently disagreed with the solution, and this would lead to another half century of debate and dissension. His goal of unity was not realized in the way that he had hoped. After the Council of Nicaea, Arius was sent into exile, but his views continued to be influential in many regions. Later, Arius from exile, and for a time sent Athanasius of Alexandria in. Constantius II ruled for 25 years. And during that time, how some compromise solutions were suggested during this period, but none gained sustained support. In the end, the debates over Arius' theology, the first convened the Council of Constantinople. Definitively confirmed Constantinople would become, after a time, it would become the kind of taken at Nicaea. It also elaborated on them, one affirming the divinity of the Holy Spirit as the third person of the Trinity. It went into more detail about how that was the case. At Constantinople, Trinitarian doctrine finally became the fully the Roman Empire, but even still, this is in many ways, or was in many ways, just the beginning of a much longer history. And it's with that history in mind that I want to focus on the legacy of the Council of Nicaea after the fourth. I'm going to give particular attention to its reception in the Coptic Orthodox Church. Now, a segment of this topic would take much more time than I have to give. Suffice it to say that Nicaea became the authoritative lens through which all were scrutinized and judged. A case in point is the debate over Christology that broke out in the first half of the 5th century, leading to the decisions taken at the Council of Chalcedon. At that council, actually, both of the sides appealed to the precedents of Nicaea. The churches of Constantinople and Rome did so in support of the council. So in telling the story, I have been foregrounding the role of major public players, bishops, emperors, international councils. In fact, most church histories do just that, focusing on big events and big personas. But the legacy, the afterlives of the Council of Nicaea can also be narrated in local detail, at the level of daily, weekly, and seasonal liturgies, where the creed is regularly invoked. At the level of laypersons, diocesan priests, and monks whose pieties have been shaped in subtler and yet sustaining ways by the council. That's the kind of ground I'd like to explore in the rest of my lecture today. I will be focusing especially on how the legacy of the Council of Nicaea was later mediated in the lives and practices of Coptic monks. That is to say, how it became part of Coptic monastic cultural memory. Let me pause to comment on this phrase, cultural memory. In using, I'm drawing on a robust area of research in the humanities, the social sciences, even the sciences, where two insights have emerged to the past via memory. The first insight is that the past is never completely past. Experience. Second, the past is mediated not simply through individual experience, but in the context of communities and their shared practices. Oh, it's on the other side? Okay. The past is not through individual perspectives, but through communities and shared practices. So when I remember my own childhood, for example, I do not do so actually, but rather through the prism of my present-day perspectives and photo albums preserved to the present day. The cultural memory of a church community is shaped in similar ways, through regular present-day gatherings for worship and retold, where participants encounter the images of holy persons from the past on church walls, that continually shape the community's sense of the past in the present. So today, as I seek monastic cultural memory, I will be utilizing related to the history of Coptic monasteries, and I will be concentrating is the monastery of Epiphanius at Thebes on the western bank of the Nile across from. The remains of this monastery, which date from the 7th and 8th centuries, were excavated by an archaeological team from the Metropolitan Museum of Art beginning in 1912 into the 1920s. The results were published in 1926 in 2 volumes by 2 scholars, H.E. Winlock. For those of you who have studied the Coptic language, you know W.E. Crum was the author of the big Coptic dictionary that many of us use. And their documentation of the project's excavation was quite extensive and methodologically attentive. That wasn't always the case for archaeological projects at the time. The resulting 2-volume publication includes chapters on local topography, architecture, material evidence for monastic trades, including construction and carpentry, agriculture and agricultural implements, shoemaking, leatherwork, pottery, and implements used for writing, eating, and liturgical rites, as well as textual evidence in Greek and Coptic, including wall writings. And those wall writings will be my primary point in the first part of my discussion. The second site that I'll be talking about is the Monastery of the Syrians, in Arabic, Der Syrian. Where, since 2013, I have directed a project to catalog the Coptic and Arabic manuscripts preserved in the monastic library. Those Coptic and Arabic manuscripts date from the 12th century to the present. There are some Syriac manuscripts and fragments that date from earlier as well. The project produced 4 catalog volumes with 5 more either in. As a result of this work, I've actually come to learn a great deal and about the community that has curated it. This collection will therefore serve as a basis for my second case study, for tracing the ways the Council of Nicaea has left its stamp on the monastery's codicological history. Patrons, librarians, and readers have kept the memory of Nicaea alive. All right, let me turn first to the story of Epiphanius at Thebes, where the memory of the Council of Nicaea was mediated through practices of writing and reading within monastic spaces. The textual evidence discovered during the Met's early 20th century excavations in liturgy, homilies, epistles, narratives, theological statements, as well as these writings are preserved on papyri, on pottery. So when we find pottery, the term for that is ostraca, on limestone, and on wall plaster. Are labeled by the authors as graffiti, but they in fact include a number of carefully planned and executed texts painted on the monuments. Such painted inscriptions today are usually referred to as dipinti. That's a Latin term meaning to paint something, right? The monastery itself, as you see in this photo, was built into a subterranean tomb built by the Daga during the 11th dynasty in Egypt, way before the history of Christianity, the 2nd millennium BC. The tomb was cut into the limestone face of the mountain cliffside, Gebel in Arabic, and featured a portico with 7 entrances, with the central entrance, apologies. Sorry, I've lost the awareness. Do you have the number? Do you have the number for the password again? 203? Is it there? No. We got it? Good. All right, forgive me, I'm gonna keep my mouse active, so you'll see the cursor go like this. So this tomb, built in the 11th dynasty, was cut into the Gebel, and it featured a portico with 7 entrances, with a central entrance giving access to a sloping passage leading down to the room containing the sarcophagus. When the tomb, this is a plan of the remains of the monastery, when the tomb was first repurposed by the monks, probably in the late 6th century, they occupied the corridor and square chamber, installed a vestibule inside the portico, and built exterior mud brick structures to accommodate rooms in front of the tomb's entrance. So I'm showing you kind of where monks would have entered this complex on this. You can see the arrow and the box there. They would have entered this complex through rooms 1 and 4, and they descend a broad flight of steps into a long, narrow vestibule. This vestibule was paved, like a floor paved with sandstone slabs. It had brick walls. It was lined with benches around the sides, on the north and south sides. These surfaces were plastered and whitewashed. So the vestibule seems to have functioned as an assembly space where the monks would have sat together. The benches show signs of wear from from sitting there, and so the monks had to replaster the benches like 3 different times. So it was clearly a space that was used frequently. Past the portico, the corridor led down into the inner chamber, which seems to have served as the founder Epiphanius' cell. In it were found papers and books that belonged to him, and along the corridor, later visitors to the space scrawled prayers invoking his name. So that's how we know this is called the Monastery of Epiphanius. As the monastery grew, as you can see from this plan, other buildings, towers, courtyards, and an exterior wall were constructed around this nucleus. So I mentioned that the vestibule featured white plastered walls with niches, and it was in these niches that late ancient Egyptian monks recorded writings of the Alexandrian church fathers, painted there in pigment. Several of these passages were quite extensive and would have been visible, easily legible, to monks seated on the benches within that space. During assemblies within the vestibule, the residents of the monastery prompted to look at, to read, and to digest the content of these texts. Prominent among them, this is a Greek dipinti documented by the excavator, originally around 60 lines in length, from Alexander of the text. In it, Athanasius warns those, quote, holding to the doctrines of Arius, who go and that by coming to you and returning back from you, they may be able to deceive the guileless. And again, certain persons who, though affirming that they do not hold the doctrines of Arius, yet consort with them and join in prayer with them. The letter also exhorts the faithful not to be among those, quote, having fellowship or joining in prayer with such people, so that, quote, they can, the Arian sympathizers, when they see that you do not join with them in prayer, will perceive that which is advantageous for them, for fear that they may be accounted blasphemers and holders of their doctrines. So the concern expressed in this letter was against Arians, people holding Arius' theology, but also those who kind of accepted them and sympathized with them, worshipped with them. This letter from Athanasius was not the only patristic writing in defense of Nicaea found on the vestibule walls. Another pair of dipinti, labeled by the excavators as inscriptions A and B, preserved Coptic fragments from a synodical letter by the late 6th century Alexandrian patriarch Damianos. Here you see a photo of the remains of that document. How extensive this was, how much time this would have taken for someone to write this carefully on the wall. This letter employs the language of the Nicene Creed and defends the doctrine of, quote, a single Godhead, the holy, coessential, consubstantial Trinity, wherein there is no creature. It also cites Athanasius' teaching on the Trinity, affirming that, quote, he, Athanasius, preached the three substances that are coessential, consubstantial. Again, homooustios. Damianos goes on to cite Athanasius' authority 4 more times, so 5 times in total, in support of the single essence and Godhead of the Trinity. Damianos lauds Athanasius as the true teacher and as wise in God's word. In the letter, he also specifically inveighs against and anathematizes, quote, the evil heresy of Arius. Just as an aside, I should also mention that amongst these writings, we also find on the walls, we also find a Greek dipinto preserving Cyril of Alexandria's anathemas against Nestorius. So we can view these writings as part of a theological genealogy in which these monks were constantly being reminded of the faith that they held to. So I've been talking about wall writings, but these are not the only surviving archaeological examples of monastic acts of inscription related to creedal formulae or the citation of Alexandrian fathers. Such evidence was also found on papyri. Sorry. I'm going to try to do my PowerPoint. See if that works better. Is it not showing? Why is it not showing? You see that? Good. Okay. So it's not just on the walls, it's also on papyri and ostraca. So we have a papyrus fragment, for example, found in a rubbish hole inside the complex that preserves what appears to be part of the beginning of the Nicene Creed itself. One God, the Father, Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth, and what is seen and not seen. The Son of God. This is fragments from that creed. Another Coptic papyrus discovered in room 5 preserves a liturgical reference to Athanasius of Alexandria. A Coptic ostracon discovered in the original monastery preserves a diatribe against 2 named followers of Arius. 2 other ostraca from the monastery contain parts of festal letters by Damianus of Alexandria. So what does all this material, and here we see the fragment from the Nicene Creed on papyrus. What does all this assorted material evidence tell us about how the Council of Nicaea functioned in monastic cultural memory at Epiphanius' foundation at Thebes? Well, first, it shows how deeply embedded the language of the council is in the monks' writing habits, in their sense of shared communal identity. In the examples I've cited, Alexandrian defenders of the creed, Athanasius, with them, were recorded both in monumental contexts, so in the place of assembly, the common room, sort of the, and also on portable media, on papyri, ostraca, that they could carry around with them, on their, maybe in a pocket, right? And of its defenders would have been eminently accessible and materially present to the inhabitants of the space. From the original scribes who wrote these texts, to those who held the papyri and ostraca in their hand and carried them with them, to those who sat or stood in the vestibule lingering for a time to read the words of these extended statements of faith recorded there. In late antiquity, the act of carrying a papyrus or ostracon inscribed with words of authority was often thought to safeguard a person from harm. When worn or held next to the body, such documents could function like talismans against baleful influence, protecting the person. Likewise, when it comes to monastic spaces like tombs and rooms of assembly, the marking of walls with authoritative texts, prayers, and crosses, that's typically understood to have a protective function for those who are residing within the space. And this was the case not only at the external thresholds of buildings, but also at internal junctures, internal places within buildings that were of marked significance. So one of the things I would suggest is that at the monastery of Epiphanius, these dipinti, these wall writings containing patristic polemics against an Arian threat, written on internal niches, may not have been directed against external threats from outside the monastery, but rather toward the danger of internal influences, the danger that members of the community might forget their fundamental Nicene allegiance and be swayed by unorthodox views. And we know that other monastic leaders during this time period and before shared this same concern. Let me give you one example from Shenouda of Atripe. In the 5th century, Shenouda wrote a treatise called I Am Amazed. This is at the White Monastery in Sohag. He's writing to monks within the monastery under his charge. And in this work, he expresses concern to them about forms of impiety and lawlessness that are revealed among us in the community, about how numerous among us are those who do not have God, about hypocrites and frauds within this community, about false Christians whose name is priest and monk, leader and father. So he's concerned about members of the community, monks, priests who have lost their way somehow. In that vein, he cursed those who cause others to stumble, those who hold the status of father and great leader, those who have the power to defile the hearts of many people in the monasteries of Christ. And later in that same treatise, he specifically invokes the language of the Nicene Creed against such internal threats. He writes, "It is manifest that when we say Jesus," this is one of my favorite passages in Shenouda, I find it very powerful. "It is manifest that when we say Jesus, we speak of the consubstantial, co-essential Trinity." So there were practices where in prayer, the utterance of the name Jesus was sufficient to affirm homoousios within the Trinity. It's often known as the Jesus prayer. And later in that work, he actually recites examples of that Jesus prayer. Finally, in that same treatise, he even cites words written by, quote, the true man of God, Appa Athanasius, the Archbishop of Alexandria. And he does so to anathematize theological meddlers, those swayed by the Arian heresy, warning his monastic brothers lest they get swept up into sin. So, when we think about what Shenouda's concerns were, and then we turn our attention back to the monastery of Epiphanius, Athanasius, Cyril, Damianus would have had a similar cursing. Were done for the sake of protecting, preserving, and purifying the community, monastery's walls. In this way, the cultural memory of the council within the architecture and on the rough surface of papyri and clay sherds. And when I use this term sedimented, I'm borrowing language from Paul Connerton's book, How Societies Remembered, where he describes how habitual acts of memory practice effectively serve to reenact the past, and how in the process the past becomes sedimented in the body as well as in the spaces those bodies call home. What I want to emphasize here is that local remembrance of Nicaea was not simply confined to abstract theological reflection. It was not confined to so-called armchair apologetics, but rather it was materially and strategically deployed in everyday practices, acts of writing and reading, along with all their associated bodily dispositions and postures. So think about a monk in that space, sitting or standing still long enough to read through the text, that long text. It inculcates a particular bodily practice as well. This is how late ancient monks at the monastery of Epiphanius incorporated the council into the lived texture of their daily lives. All right, that's my first case study. My second case study is Der Syrian, the collection of manuscripts at the monastery of the Syrians. Now, the contents of, I want to introduce you very quickly to this monastic library. This library has not been digitized, and I can answer in Q&A why it has not been digitized. There's reasons. And so it's generally not accessible unless you get special invitation or you get special requests to visit the library. And so it's been a gift to have been allowed to do this work. The library itself is organized according to 7 major literary categories or genres, as well as 1 minor category. So the 7 major categories are biblical texts, kutub muqaddasa in Arabic, commentaries, tafasir, canons, qawanin, theology, lahut, ascetic discourses, nuskiyat, saints' lives and sermons, this is all grouped within the term mayamr, and liturgy, tukus. The 8th minor category is Coptic language resources, lugha qibtiyya. And that category is comprised of things like medieval grammars, written in Arabic, but for people who want to remember and learn Coptic, right? And lexicon. Worthy of note is that every major literary genres, one finds references made to the Council of Nicaea. So I searched through our database, the information we recorded from our work there, and it shows that biblical texts, canons, theology, and liturgy feature the most hits. 2 of the earliest volumes date from the 14th century. One is a canons volume from 1343. Another is a biblical volume from 1396. But most of the examples come from manuscripts later, copied in the 18th and 19th century. And this is in part simply a feature of preservation practices, right? Books get used up, they don't survive, they get recopied. And so the majority of the texts are from 18th and 19th century now. More larger quantities within the collection. That the different genre categories that you see here to different functions of the library and different practices in the consumption of monastic readers. So today I want to highlight quickly 6 different sets of practices related to the production and use of books at the monastery. And each of these practices facilitated a different kind of engagement with Nicaea as a marker of Coptic Orthodox monastic identity. So I'm going to begin with the most ubiquitous practical setting for the remembrance of Nicaea, and that is the liturgy. It was in the daily, weekly, and seasonal rhythms of Egyptian monastic ritual life that monastic participants in worship were most often prompted to recall the council as paradigmatic for Coptic Orthodox identity. One context for such practice was the daily office, the horologion. 2 Arabic manuscripts at Der Syrian serve as evidence for such practice in the 14th and 18th century, respectively. These are manuscripts 14 and 761. Each contains the psalms and hymns related to the hourly prayers, along with liturgical elements from the horologion. One of the elements is a section recording the content of the Nicene Creed to be read aloud as part of that rite. So in manuscript 14, a biblical manuscript dated 1396, this section is labeled the Orthodox Faith for All the Churches. In manuscript 761, dated to 1750, The same section is entitled The Orthodox Faith that the 318 fathers ratified at Nicaea. A second liturgical context for the remembrance of Nicaea is the celebration of feast days. In two different liturgy manuscripts containing the seasonal hymns called Torohet, we find hymns. Oh, sorry. Take a break. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to do this. Oh. Shall I just continue? I was going to show you a lot of manuscripts. I apologize. It's not allowing me to do it. Okay. Okay. So these seasonal hymns called Torohet, we find hymns on the Council of Nicaea to be chanted on the feast day of 9 Hator, commemorating this historical event. I should also note that the Synaxarium, the calendrical hagiographical collection for the Coptic Orthodox, also has an entry dedicated to Nicaea to be read aloud on that day. A brief narrative that tells the story of the righteous Emperor Constantine's convening of the council, the prominent Alexandrian presence there in the persons of the Bishop Alexander, and then his then secretary Athanasius, and the judgment rendered against Arius. The entry incorporates the full text of the Nicene Creed and concludes with a note on how the Alexandrian patriarchs were authorized to determine the proper date of Easter. So here's some examples of those feast day hymns and the Synaxarium. I should say that the library at Derusurian preserves multiple copies of this text. 4 different manuscripts contain the Synaxarian entries for the first half of the year, including the month Hator. Range in date from the 14th century to the 19th century. 6 more contain the Lel, which lists in shorthand all the feast days across the annual cycle. The only 2 dated volumes in this group were copied in the 18th and 19th centuries. Do I have a copy? Here's an example of the frontispiece Synaxarium in the collection. So in any case, along with the Torohet, these copies of the Synaxarium and its index give witness to the way the Council of Nicaea entered into the calendrical cycle of Coptic feast days as a ritual context for yearly commemoration. In addition to such liturgical practices, forms of remembrance, the Library of Derusurian catechological practices of canonization, collection, and theological commentary, in which the Council of Nicaea was recognized and marked as the definition of orthodoxy without parallel. The earliest dated canons manuscript in the collection is Derusurian Manuscript 102, copied in 1343. The contents of this volume include different canons of the apostles and a series of conciliar canons, beginning with Ankara, Carthage, Sardica, Laodicea, and ending with Nicaea. One of the things that's indicative here is that the amount of pages dedicated to Nicaea any of the other councils. So in that particular manuscript, Nicaea and its canons take up 72, even more than all 5 combined. And sometimes Nicaea is, I'm not going to go into the details here just to save time, but sometimes Nicaea is listed last, sort of as a capstone, because it has precedence, right? So the way that the council is navigated, but Nicaea is always given a certain kind of precedence, at very least because of the amount of folia that are dedicated to it. We also see so I want to talk about how there is also commentary on the Nicene Creed in the collection. I think I have an example of Derusurian Manuscript 90. This is an undated manuscript, but copied before. I'm just going to keep reading. It's copied before 1730, so it's at least the 18th century, probably earlier. And in that manuscript, somebody mentioned the Book of Revelation earlier. We have a copy of the Book of Revelation, and then at the end of it, a commentary on the Nicene Creed. And what's interesting to me is that this juxtaposition of biblical and conciliar modes of commentary and the shelving of this under commentary shows how the scribes, the librarians in this monastery were aware of, they were cognizant of how canonization and commentary were complementary, how they informed each other, right? So recording the canons, but also commenting on them. You were talking about how it requires interpretation, right? So I think you see that in practice here. One manuscript in the theology section of the library attests to the fact that this was a new endeavor or confined to monastic settings. Are any of you familiar with Suwairis ibn al-Muqaffa, famous 10th century, one of our earliest witnesses? Production of original theology in Arabic. And we have 2 copies of works by him in the collection, including his book on the councils and the Book of the Precious Pearl. And these works are devoted principally to the systematic discussion and theological interpretation of conciliar decrees and patristic doctrine. That manuscript notably ends with a commentary on the Nicene Creed. So you see how the production of theology and the remembrance of the Creed goes together. So in each example from across the multidisciplinary library holdings in 3 different classificatory areas, we see how monastic cultural memory of Nicaea intersecting literary practices, canonization. I want to end by talking at the ground level. I want to talk about the role that scribes in this collection. Let me begin with a scribal. 20, a deacon copied a Mayamer volume containing 74 miracles of the Virgin. The scribe, other than that, the information he provides about himself in the colophon to that manuscript, where he notes that he was known at, quote, the house of the Ethiopians. Excuse me, the house of the Ethiopian. This cryptic aside may be a reference to this small community of Ethiopian monks who had established a monastic house in the monastery of the Syrians by the early modern period. And I have a forthcoming article that actually traces the historical presence of Ethiopian monks in Wadi Natrum. But for the purposes of my discussion today, let me just quote from a 19th century visitor to Deir Surian. This was the English traveler Robert Curzon, who notes that this community of Ethiopian monks occupied a building with a flat roof in the southeast corner of the enclosure, close to the outer wall of the monastery, where they maintained a consistory and a library. And this library would eventually become the basis for the monastery's current small collection of Ethiopic manuscripts, and those manuscripts have also been cataloged recently. So this is a multilingual community, and of course, the Council of Nicaea was being remembered across those linguistic divides. So this scribe, Jirjis ibn Yusuf al-Mansuri, may be identifying himself as belonging to this very community. And in this colophon, he not only provides the date of his completion of the manuscript and identifies himself by name, but he also invokes the faith of the councils of Nicaea, Constantinople, and Ephesus as a sign and seal of the orthodoxy of his endeavor. We have even more abundant evidence for the role that literary patrons played in the production of manuscripts in the collection. So patrons typically wrote that were dedicated usually to the monastery itself. Sort of, this is a gift to the monastery. And those walks are very revealing about how the role that the Council of Nicaea played. And I count a total of 8 different manuscripts in which, in those walk statements, patrons incorporated mentions of the Council of Nicaea or a condemnation of Arius as part of the dedication. In each of these cases, Nicaea, this mentioning of Nicaea was meant to assert and confirm the theological orthodoxy of the manuscript. It also had a much more specific and practical purpose, namely to serve as a warning and a threat against anyone who might think about removing the book from the collection, right? Like maybe a monk is interested in a manuscript and borrows it and doesn't remember to return it. And so these walks were meant to say, hey, wait a minute, if you do something like that, you're going to come to the same fate as Arius. So one example, manuscript 188, this is a Nicaea, Ascetic Discourses manuscript, contains a 3-part endowment in which the writer of the walk issues a warning to readers about the judgment rendered against Arius. It invokes the councils of Nicaea, Constantinople, and Ephesus, and issues a threat to potential thieves. He also invokes Simon Magus and Diocletian, so they're serious about this threat. In a Miami manuscript containing the miracles of the Archangel Michael, we read, the person who writes the waqf emphasizes that anyone violating this waqf will be, quote, excommunicated by the mouth of the 3 councils, Ephesus, Nicaea, and Constantinople. And we see this pattern repeated. Warnings against unauthorized sale, against loaning it out, against theft. I'll move on. A waqf, we also see this in a liturgy manuscript from the 19th century, aiming to prevent theft by evoking an anathema from the mouth of the 318 fathers of Nicaea and all the councils. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. So this becomes a regular practice of the patronage and production of manuscripts, where the Council of Nicaea is like a sign and a seal of orthodoxy and a protection against unauthorized use. And note that scribes and patrons were not the only to leave their stamp in the texts in ways that mark the remembrance of Nicaea. In manuscripts is that you'll see little marginal notations by readers, prayers, Uzkurni ya Rab, right? Remember me, O Lord. And sometimes with more information about who they were, when they were reading it, prayers for family members named, etc. So we have one example, liturgy manuscript, manuscript 1057. This is a manuscript containing the ordination and consecration rites for the church. Must have been produced before 1639. That's when the waqf statement was written, so we know that it was copied before that. On one of the folia in that volume, a Syriac-speaking reader made his own addition in the margin, writing the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed in Syriac in the margin of one of the pages. So scribes, patrons, readers. This brief survey of where and how the Council of Nicaea makes appearances in Coptic and Arabic manuscripts at Der Suryan shows quite vividly, I think, how the Council remained a live concern for monastic authors, collectors, commentators, scribes, patrons, and readers who activated the memory of Nicaea in a variety of ways, through practices of composition, canonization, and interpretation, through the catechological marking of the community's concern for orthodoxy, and for the protection and preservation of books. In conclusion, as we saw in the case of the monastery of Epiphanius, the Council of Nicaea became materialized at Der Suryan, catalyzed in Coptic monastic cultural memory, time and time again through monastic acts of writing, reading, whether on the plastered surface of mud brick walls or on folia, leather-bound volumes. Egyptian monks across generations have continued They encountered and attended to, carefully curated the legacy of the council, marking it as a constituent part of their religious and social life. Through such a repertoire of practices, the history of Nicaea to be written, read, and remembered. Thank you very much.
I can't take notes, I just have to listen. And maybe later on, Orthodox Church. It's amazing to know that. Celebration at the national level of Nicaea, and I thought 30 papers were presented, as I told you, and I thought I heard everything about Nicaea. There is nothing more that I can listen to about Nicaea, but from the two presentations, almost like especially your presentations, all new for me. So I guess Nicaea is an ocean of information that we can take and never enough of. Can we take some questions, please? And please, if you have a question, please just line up on the side.
Thanks so much, Dr. Davis. This was very impressive, and I would like to thank you for digging deeper into our rich culture, monasteries, and thank you so much for even hosting our monks coming here, the librarian. I remember Father Eulogius Suriani, how you treat him very well here at Yale University.
Father Bagol, actually.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So I have a question that is, I'd love to see if there is a study about this or not. Should us, how the outside world was correlated actually to the monastic life. So the monastic life, they didn't have internet, they didn't have any kind of ways to even to exchange information, but we know that how Saint Athanasius went to Saint Antonius, then Saint Antonius going out to the world, so showing that how the monastic life actually emphasized and empowered our dogma that Saint Athanasius outside the world was like fighting for. So is there any study showing the factor and effect? Which one was the initial one? Is it Saint Athanasius being at that time visiting the monasteries, or Saint Antonius who is visiting outside and Saint Shenouda? So is there any study, is there any finding regarding the factor and effect? Which one comes first?
Which one comes first? Is this still on? Yeah. Which one comes first between Athanasius on the one hand and some of the monastic leaders?
Life and the outside world.
Yeah.
So the church at that studies to the nowadays world, you will say, oh yeah, we can tell, yeah, they are doing all this stuff, and even one of the slides, by the way, about Saint Epiphanius, I saw a sign of Wi-Fi. Do you see this? The Wi-Fi sign. That's amazing. Yeah. So would like to know more if there is any study or there's any finding you found it by yourself. Thanks so much.
So if you're interested in, say, the 4th century, the context of Athanasius himself, I mean, I remember when one of the books that was mentioned, it was the book on the Coptic papacy. I was writing on the early Coptic papacy, say the first, up to the rise of Islam, for example. And One of the things that was very striking to me, and you can tell this from the first lecture as well, this was a period when the church was striving after unity and struggling to get there. And I think that Athanasius played a very pivotal role in consolidating the authority of the Alexandrian bishopric over the geography of Egypt. And part of that was involved with his correspondence with and visitation of monks. Like, I think his practice of visiting monasteries was part of a successful effort to draw in a unity across different constituencies within the wider Coptic Orthodox Church, right? So that would be one example. I see like you kind of said, on the one hand, I'm taking Athanasius as like a representative bishop, right? Pope. On the other hand, you have these monastic leaders, and I see them as symbiotic at that time, right? There are ways in which Athanasius was lending patronage to the monasteries, and the monasteries were responding in kind. And so I think that is, I think, one distinctive, pivotal role that Athanasius played. That's just one example. As you know, up through the history of the church, even into the 21st century, the relationship between the Coptic papacy, bishoprics, and monasteries continues to be a very vital, enlivening part of the life of the church, right? Yeah.
I kind of have a related question. So on the walls you were showing, for example, some of the writings of the Alexandrian fathers and how the Coptic ones were very influenced by that. But I was kind of curious about how did the interchange of two very distinct cultures go? So for example, many of the patriarchs in Alexandria famously didn't speak Coptic, like say Dioscorus and those before him. And he even has writings where he would ask someone to translate to the Coptic monks for him.
Right.
So how did the theological concepts get transmitted down? Because they're very, Greek and philosophical and Aristotelian. How did they transmit that over? How did the interchange between them work? And how did the Church of Christ become more thoroughly Coptic in nature as time went on? So this is kind of curious about.
Sure. The first thing I would say is that a lot of these monastic communities were bilingual. In the case of the Adosaurian, multilingual, right, later on. And the examples I was citing, for example, from the monastery of Epiphanius, were preserved in both Greek and Coptic, right? So some in the language of the original documents and some translated. And that was a hugely important factor, right, for the way in which theology written in Greek originally became Copticized, right? If you read a lot of these documents, take Shenouda's I Am Amazed. Shenouda is known as a leader who had both Coptic and Greek. How much Greek he had is not clear, but he clearly, in his writings, was drawing on Greek terminology, technical terminology. And it's interesting to see there are places where, like homoousios, the term homoousios gets imported in that form, in the Coptic texts. And there are other cases where, like one example would be Theotokos, the mother of God, where you see both the Theotokos as a technical Greek term in Shenouda's writing, but also the Coptic equivalent, she who bore Christ, right? So I see that as a very dynamic theological and cultural engine that kind of motivated the transmission of this knowledge and of these practices in different settings. And you can track that in different terms, even up into the Arabization of the Coptic Church, right? When it was a different kind of transition moment. And I mentioned Sawiris ibn Muqaffa as a kind of early figure where you begin to see the articulation of what had been Greek theology translated into Coptic is now entering an Arabic lexicon. And that's a very interesting, and this is something that, when I did my PhD, I didn't know Arabic. And it was only when I went to Egypt was teaching in an Arabic language institution. I had to learn Arabic to teach in it. And I began reading authors like Boulos al-Bushi, because I was teaching a theological college. I needed theological vocabulary. I was beginning to read this medieval stuff, and it's such a rich context. And it's rich theologically, but it's also rich in how you see these processes at work, right? As the kind of next generation of linguistic transition and rearticulation. I don't know if that answers, but yeah.
No, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
That's a good point about too, about even when you do like the Arabic kind of stage.
Yeah.
And stuff. I guess that's like another technology.
That's become a point of fascination for me on my own research. I do a lot of work now on Arabic stuff. Just it's so rich. There's so much to do. If you're interested in finding something to work on in research, that area is so much to do. Little plug.
So the right doctrine was kind of central in these monasteries' lives, and we see in the secularization of culture, there's more of a focus on the social aspect of Christianity, whereas doctrine can be sometimes set aside in more extreme circumstances. So I was wondering if you could speak to our current secular culture and the importance of maintaining right doctrine and fostering that for our culture and for life in the church.
Can I ask you to elaborate on what you have in mind by secular culture and how you see it having an imprint on these questions?
This sort of the move away from faith and organized religion, maybe.
Okay. I mean, one of the I think this is what I'm about to say is reflected in kind of what I talked about today and how I framed what I wanted to talk about. This also relates to a deep interest in mine, and that is, and I will say that and this has been inspired by my engagement with the Coptic Orthodox community and kind of seeing how this plays out. But I come out of a Protestant setting in which faith works. In my own work, began that, first of all, but also the rich ways in which one sees the way of practice in the Coptic Orthodox setting. So like the way in which doctrines of the incarnation were not simply written about in kind of like doctrinal, like formal doctrine, and enacted in ways maybe unexpected, not just in, say, the liturgy, but in a range of contexts of piety in which the incarnation was seen as crucial to the life of faith. And when I say life of faith, I mean the life of faith, right? So I was asking you the question about secularization because I think even the category of secularization in the modern world poses a false binary. If it sets the so-called secular over here and the so-called religious over here. I think theology and what you described as social practice. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but that's the way I would think about reframing the concern and what I observe in my engagement with, in this case, with the Coptic Orthodox community, both historically, in, for example, the historical materials that I've been talking about today, but also in the contemporary life of faith, right? I think they go together. Well, I will say, I'll speak for, say, let me take Protestant contexts as an example. I think Protestant separation, it has had the cost of forgetting or not being able to understand or see the importance of body, emotions in the life of faith. That's a very blanket statement. I come out of a particular Calvinistic context where that is especially prominent. You have other Protestant contexts that have much more of an emotion-filled life. But I will say that the separation of those categories means that the body doesn't, right? And when you think about, just think for your own context, bodies matter. As a pun, like the matter of bodies matter, right? There's ways in which blessing is conveyed through materialities that are also understood to be connected with affirmations that are being made, right? And so, and even in the act of saying that, I'm separating out the life of faith. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for the great presentation, and I would echo what our great that you made us jealous being Egyptian, and we didn't know about these things, so I think we will get carried. I have just one question for you and maybe another question for our. The first one is I wanted to know if they are from in Nicaea Council, so we know we're from the Eastern Church. So it was just a couple, I think, that Pope Sylvester sent. Although this was the very first time. So this is a question, and maybe another question to our Bishop. So it is not to reduce the role of Saint Sabirus of Antioch. They cannot visit Egypt without going to Ma'allaqa Church and take his blessings. But why the Coptic Orthodox Church in the commemoration of the saints put Saint Sabirus the Antioch or of Antioch before Saint Athanasius? However, Saint Athanasius was before, like a couple hundred years before, and Saint Athanasius was the only one, of course, plus Saint Paul, that he was titled or entitled apostle. However, he didn't see Jesus. So in the three liturgies, we find him comes after Saint Sabirus, and I know his role in what he did to defend, of course, our faith, Saint Sabirus, and we all love him, but why we put him before. So thank you so much, and I'm sorry if I took long.
Sayed, I think you should answer that question, please. The first one? Yeah, I'll allow Sayed to answer the second question. The first question, I think there are complicated reasons. I think most of the early councils were primarily Eastern Christian councils. That was in part because they were being hosted by who is now situated in the East. And there were, I don't mean this pejoratively, but there are also practical, like logistical reasons for that. Like they didn't have planes. I'm looking at you, Brother Antonius. Brother Antonius is a saint. Struggled through the martyrdom of airline travel to get here. Sometimes it doesn't work out the way, but they didn't even have that option back then. And so getting from Rome to so I think there's a complicated range of reasons for that. And that affects, right? And the logistical aspects, I think, created communication was not easy, and it led to misunderstanding.
Professor Dr. Davis for this wonderful presentation, answering all the questions. I think the terms I like to use always is orthodoxia is about the faith, and orthopraxia is, praxia comes from practice. It's the way of life. And I always like to think of orthodoxia and orthopraxia as two sides of the same coin. So we cannot separate them, we cannot divorce them. We cannot think of orthodoxia alone, which means the faith alone doesn't work. Because if faith is not reflected, then what's the point? So always remember that faith is not just orthodoxia, which is the faith, but also the orthopraxia, which is the way of life. And I hope that you are inspired to do more reading and research of our history, and it's amazing how our fathers have kept the even through inscription on the wall, so that every time the faith. Just to enter the question about the mentioning of sense, ask why, right? So if we put it, but when something is out of order, then you say why. So even ahead of our Savior, his role, and reading his history and his struggles and how he had to flee to Egypt, etc., is very why the Coptic Church has put him. Our celebrations, just have a couple of announcements. This at 6:30, we bought a new church, formerly a Greek church by the name of Saints Constantine and Helen. And we bought it recently, like a couple of weeks ago. We're going to pray Vespers today. Anastasia is going to pray liturgy. After we finish here, I'm going to join me. And because this year is dedicated to Saint, and of course we the same era during that council, Nicaea, the emperor was emperor, and his mother Helen, and how she went to the Holy Land to find the cross of our Lord and to the Holy Land, the Holy Sacrifice. So the names, but we add Saint Athanasius. Yes, today is the commemoration of so hopefully you can join me if you want. The address, it's in Chicopee, Massachusetts. I think it's about an hour from here. We will have the Vespers at 6:30. أبين الأيقونة الأولى. أبونا شو؟
So thank you, Dr. Davis, for yet another enlightening speech. Let's give him another round of applause. I'm sure you're all hungry, because I know I am. So we're going to be having lunch in just a little bit, and we'll be back again around 3:15, if possible, please, with a change of pace. So now our next segments will include music and choir presentations, as well as a little bit of theater. So after which as His Grace mentioned, we also pray Vespers and conclude this memorable and historic day. So, bon appetit. So, but before we go, we have some gifts to our beloved speakers and distinguished speakers. So I'd like to invite them both to please come up, Deacon Antonius and Dr. Stephen Jacobs. And the gift is an icon of Saint Athanasius the Apostolic in the Coptic writing, in the Coptic tradition.
There's a committee of the fathers who have been working diligently for the past year to prepare for this day, so I'd like at this point to invite them and give them an icon as well of Saint Athanasius. This committee was led by Father Isaac, so I want to give him this of all. Father Marcus from Rhode Island. Father Bishoy from Connecticut, and Father Thomas. Father Cyril, and Father Joseph. ناخد صورة. Come, let's take another picture with the fathers. خلي البروفيسور يجي.
On behalf of the committee, we want to present a small gift to him and for his love to all of us.
But this is not small. Oh, thank you. Hello, thank you. حاجة تانية؟
Abuna, from the Indian church. Father George. Abuna. Yes, Father.
Father Kyriakos.
And the Dean. Dr. Timothy, please.
Father Kyriakos and Dr. Timothy, please. خلاص قول لهم بس هنرجع الساعة كام؟
All right. So
صورنا يا عم، كان الصورة الحلوة دي. جت؟ مش مشكلة. ازيك يا اخ ابراهيم؟ ربنا يعمل لك التلميذ. انا غلبان، انا ما اعرفش اتكلم.
fine.
Now we're going to listen to the most famous hymn called Onagenis, and this hymn is well known in all many churches, even some other churches other than the Coptic Orthodox Church. The gospel, before the gospel. However, we sing this hymn 3 times. It's written by really a good hymn. The Coptic Church took 3 chords again, one more time, part, and changed this hymn. You hymn, and the meaning is repeatable for the Logos.
salvation did not accept all suffering, who and was crucified, Christ, who and was crucified, Christ, God, and the Holy Spirit, save us. Holy God, who being the Spirit, save us. Holy God, who being this showed forth what is who was crucified for our sake and endured death in his flesh, the eternal and